The period of history that we call the industrial age is coming to an end, and peoples all over the world are being affected by it. I'm going to focus on the way work has changed. Work is, after all, a central part of everybody's life, or most people's lives. Money played a very much smaller part in their lives than it does in ours, because we are now dependent on buying things that we can't produce for ourselves and for one another. And so most work then, of course, was unpaid. Men and women divided the work of the household between them, and children helped their parents work as soon as the children were old enough to begin to take some part in it. They got most of their education that way, by doing what they were capable of doing as they grew up. And the older generation, too, had useful functions to perform. For example, the grandmothers looked after the young children while the adults were busy working. Everybody had a productive and useful function. Work, like other activities, was an integral part of family and local life. The creation of wealth and the provision of welfare were not regarded as totally separate functions, as we tend to regard them if we think about them today. The production of goods and the provision of services and care by people for themselves and one another were interwoven threads in the fabric of everybody's daily life. Do well to remember that way of life, as I said, had convivial features. Economic and social relationships were personal then, predominantly, not impersonal and organizational as they are today. Also, people generally had access to their own means of production, to land and livestock and the buildings and the simple equipment and tools that they needed to organize their own work. No one imagined that a day would come when people would be dependent on something called employers to provide them with the wherewithal for work. Now, I've got this in mind. I see the path into the future in terms of a sort of visual model. And on the one hand, I think it can be helpful to think of it as a spiral, that as we go on into the future, hopefully progressing upwards, we turn to some extent backward on our tracks. We recover some of the good things that we lost from a previous period of time. I think it's sometimes helpful to reflect and consider whether we may have reached the end of the 200 years of the industrial age. We've been moving in a particular direction, and the time has now come when beginning to be poised for a move still forward, but in the other direction, in some senses in the opposite direction. Predominantly rural areas where there is still the wherewithal and the possibility for a good deal of self-reliance may be better positioned to move in the direction that we may be now thinking we shall have to go in. I'm not particularly criticizing or inveighing against the world market as such. I'm just pointing out that when you specialize, you become vulnerable on circumstances and changes which are quite outside your own control. With specialization, there has come a formalization, where previously we produced goods and provided services for ourselves and one another on a person-to-person basis without being paid. We now carry out exactly the same activities in many cases as paid workers for organizations which provide goods and services to customers, consumers and clients. We don't act and work people for people. We work as employee for clients or employee for consumers or whatever it may be. And indeed, almost everyone else, almost all of us, until quite a short time ago, came to assume that the formal sphere of activity was the only sphere that matters. The formal economy, in which people's work takes the form of jobs and in which transactions have a money tag attached, has been the only part of the economy that counts. This assumption that economic and social activities of human beings don't really count unless economists and accountants and statisticians can actually count them, is one example of a much wider feature of our mode of thought during the industrial age and for 1 or 2 centuries before. It stems from Descartes, who split the world of understanding into 2 halves. The half that you could measure and count and understand scientifically, and the rest, the spiritual or the unmeasurable side, which thinkers and scientists of the industrial age agreed to push on one side, until it became almost a superstition, even to think that there might be some reality in that uncountable, intangible aspect of life. This is becoming very clear now, I think, in new thinking about health, and it's becoming very clear now in some of the new thinking at the frontiers of science, that only within the last 6 or 7 or 8 years have increasing numbers of people in the industrialized countries come to realize that we have a dual economy with a formal part and an informal part, and only in about the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, people generally are coming to realize informal part of the economy in which people act as people for themselves and one another is of significance and of growing significance. Moreover, we're beginning to understand that what passes for economic growth in industrial thinking is often no more than a simple transfer of activity from the informal part to the formal part. I'll give you an example of this. A family called McNabb. Now, Mrs. McNabb used to make breakfast for her husband and 4 teenage children, and no money changed hands, of course. And then a fast food chain set up a branch in the neighborhood. Mrs. McNabb decided that she would earn a little bit of money. She went to work for a few hours every morning at McDonald's, making breakfast for the customers. And what did her husband and children do? Well, they decided that since there was extra money coming into the family, they better go and get their breakfast at McDonald's. And it so worked out that what they, all of them together, pay for breakfast exactly cancels out what Mrs. McNabb earns for her hour and a half or a couple of hours working there. So the McNabbs as a family are no better off. The situation is exactly the same. But that doesn't matter to the economists. In fact, the economists are delighted. They're rubbing their hands because economic growth has taken place. Money is changing hands, is going into the economic statistics, and the gross national product has just edged up by a little bit. Now, that's a trivial example of something that's happening generally all over all the industrialized economies. Just little changes like that are happening in millions of multitudes, changes of transaction like that. And they are a substantial part in the rise in which what we've been taught to calculate as economic growth. The more serious side of that is that positive disasters count as a plus on economic growth calculations. A tremendous amount of activity is generated by a disaster. That increased activity all counts as economic growth. Now, people are beginning to be wise or understand these conceptual absurdities in our present way of thinking about economics. And they're beginning to realize that employment as such is not necessarily always the best way to work. Some of the positively undesirable features of employment, which are beginning to become a little more apparent to us,